that's fine. Please let us know and we'll eliminate your question or objection or the things you say from the recording. Good. So yeah, going to this seminar. This is a seminar organized by the Sheffield Animal Studies Research Center. And today we have Aksel Sterri from the University of Otago. He's a PhD student. And we have Andy Stawasz. I'm probably mispronouncing your surname, I'm sorry. Who is a legal fellow at the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University. And it's a paper co-authored with Aksel Sterri from the University of Oxford.
The Oslo Metropolitan University. But,
okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
And the title is Taxing Animal Suffering to Reduce It.
Yeah.
Thanks, Asher. And
Awesome. Yeah. Cool. So sorry about the slight delays. Yeah, we were just like figuring out usual technology type stuff. But yeah, so as Diego said, my name's Asher. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Otago. I'm just wrapping up my thesis at the moment, and my doctoral research is actually mostly about wild animal welfare and yeah, sentience and consciousness and stuff like that. But the talk today is about farm animal welfare, which is something that's very dear to me. I've kind of been interested and involved in animal advocacy throughout my whole life, and last year I visited the O'Hara Centre for Practical Ethics in Oxford as a visiting, I guess like visiting researcher, and yeah, met Aksel during my visitation, and he had this amazing idea for taxing animal suffering as a maybe like more systemic way of preventing it. And yeah, I guess over the past year we've been just slowly chipping away at the idea and turning it into a paper. And so this is what I'm going to present today. Cool, so hopefully there shouldn't be too many problems. I'm kind of clicking through on two computer screens. But yeah, the basic outline of the paper is that, or the basic outline of this presentation, which reflects the outline of the paper, is that first we address the problem of farm animal suffering, and we try and break it down into the problem resulting from economic incentives in the market for animal products. And then we look at one proposed solution to the problem of farm animal suffering, which is animal welfare regulations. Then we propose our solution, which is a suffering tax. Then third, we go over some practical challenges relating to implementing the suffering tax, and this includes quantifying and measuring suffering on farms. And then last, we'll quickly cover some objections, and this includes some more market-based and also more theoretical, I guess, like principled objections. So yeah, to begin, the problem of farm animal suffering. Since this is a animal ethics type audience, I guess I don't have to go into too much detail here. You guys are all probably familiar with the scale and severity of farm animal suffering, but briefly, more than 80 billion vertebrate land animals worldwide are slaughtered annually for food. Roughly 99% of these animals, at least in the United States, are reared under intensive farming conditions, which we call factory farms. And like us, these animals are sentient beings. They have the capacity to suffer. We define suffering in the paper as an experience where the overall valence is net negative, so that from the subject's point of view, it's better not to experience anything than to suffer. And yeah, farm animals on factory farms suffer from a wide variety of preventable conditions listed on the slide. So yeah, given the severity of their suffering, it's plausible that many farm animals lead prudentially net negative lives, lives not worth living for their own sake. So there are two forceful objections against animal husbandry. One objection is that it's morally wrong to kill non-human animals merely just to satisfy human preferences for food and clothing products. The second objection is that this practice inflicts immense suffering, which is pro tanto morally wrong and should be avoided. And our paper leaves aside the former objection, and we focus on addressing the problem of suffering directly. It's therefore aimed at making animal husbandry practices more ethically robust, rather than advocating for their total abolition. However, we argue later in the paper that abolitionists and others who are opposed to the existence of factory farms should welcome our proposal because of its expected benefits on animal welfare. So yeah, proceeds on the basis of 2. So economics of farm animal suffering. First, it's important to note that farm animal suffering is not actually required in order to produce animal products. Rather, it's a contingent kind of byproduct of the production process for animal products. To take an example, whether a chicken suffers a small amount or a large amount over the course of her life generally does not affect the quality of the eggs or the meat that she produces. And this means that other things being equal, farm animal suffering could be reduced to the point that animals lead lives that are worth living, maybe even like amazing lives, simply by taking steps to improve their living conditions. Moreover, we also think that in most cases when farm animals suffer, it's unintentional rather than being deliberately caused by malicious humans. According to a recent survey, 85% of animal farmers and their families oppose the very existence of intensive farming practices. So we think while there might be some bad actors working in the industry who actually enjoy harming animals, these cases are the minority, and this isn't the main reason why farm animals suffer. Rather, suffering is a predictable result of the economic incentives in the market for animal products. A farmer's survival in the market depends upon the extent to which they're more successful than their competitors at satisfying consumer preferences. And factory farming is usually the most cost-efficient method of producing animal products at scale. So there's a selection pressure for factory farms to exist. Taking steps to reduce farm animal suffering often requires making concessions that would otherwise reduce economic productivity. And as such, farmers who seek to improve animal welfare at the expense of cost efficiency will actually be at an economic disadvantage compared to other farmers. This reduces their market competitiveness. And yeah, because of these factors, we think there's an inbuilt pressure in the market system against improving animal welfare. So what are some market solutions? We note that there are maybe some economic incentives that are favorable to farmers who want to reduce animal suffering. For example, one might say that to the extent that working under conditions which impose severe suffering on animals is aversive to workers, we should expect them to demand a wage premium, which could disincentivize the practice. But unfortunately, given that many workers in factory farms have a limited set of alternative opportunities to make ends meet, this wage premium is unlikely to make that much of a difference. And this is evident from their salaries. The average pay for farm workers in the United States is less than $15 an hour. And moreover, many such workers are on immigrant visas and paid even less than this. So we don't think this is a strong enough reason. Secondly, one might argue that consumers are willing to pay for a premium for humanely raised animals, and maybe this would incentivize improved animal welfare. So for example, surveys suggest that most Americans are concerned about the welfare implications of intensive farming practices and prefer practices that treat animals better. Similar levels of concern have been documented globally, and they appear to be increasing over time. This intuitively suggests that the market for animal products can regulate itself, given that over time supply chains will adapt and adjust to the expressed preferences of consumers. However, consumers' concern for animal welfare does not usually translate into an actionable willingness to pay for more expensive products from animals who are treated well. It's simply not enough that consumers want less suffering. They also need to be well informed about the circumstances surrounding the production of a given product. They need to prioritize animal welfare over other things that they could spend their money on, and they need to change their behavior in order to accord more with their ethical beliefs. As we all know, these conditions are often not met. And this is referred to as the value action gap in behavioral economics. So if the market can't regulate itself, what about external intervention? So this has been the traditional approach, usually by government intervention, to ensure that farm animals are treated better than they would be in an unregulated market. Farmers often have a legal obligation to treat their livestock above a certain threshold, and they're punished for breaking these regulations through the use, say, of financial sanctions. This makes animal mistreatment costly and theoretically reduces animal suffering if the expected cost of the sanctions is higher than the expected profit that comes from breaking these regulations. But a problem with this approach is that it's just really difficult to enforce, given how many farm animals exist and how little funding is usually allocated toward enforcement agencies. So I'm from New Zealand, and in New Zealand, a country with 37 million approximately livestock and 120 million chickens, the Ministry for Primary Industries only employs 27 inspectors to enforce the Animal Welfare Act. Most policing agencies depend upon animal welfare violations being reported, in which case the harm has already been caused, or being observed during routine inspections, which are obviously not representative of the average conditions of animals due to notice being given. And moreover, if they're reported, because these violations occur on private property and behind closed doors, it's unclear who's expected to submit these reports other than the farmers themselves. So this is broadly problematic, we think. Overall, we think, these regulations are effective at reducing some suffering, but they're unfortunately limited in their capacity to address the problem of excessive suffering, which is suffering that occurs beyond the stipulated threshold. And this is because they don't incentivize the reduction of suffering beyond that threshold. The system works to an extent, but it's far from ideal given the scale and severity of farm animal suffering in the world. So this leads me to our proposed solution and the primary contribution of our paper, which is the proposal for a suffering tax. So we believe that in order to effectively reduce farm animal suffering, we should directly tax it. We've argued that the problem of excessive farm animal suffering results from systemic conditions in the market for animal products. This implies that the ideal solution to this problem directly addresses these systemic conditions, which we think a tax on suffering accomplishes. So the tax could be based on properties which were intrinsic to the disvalue or disutility of suffering, namely the duration and intensity of each suffering experience. The total tax burden that each farm would therefore increase in accordance with these variables, taking into account the number of animals that suffer over the course of a tax year. And to use a familiar analogy, maybe, pollution such as greenhouse gas emissions is considered a negative externality in markets where the economic incentives aren't well calibrated to prevent their release. And this represents a market failure, as the cost of these emissions isn't borne by those who produce them, but by society at large. The result is overproduction of polluting goods and underinvestment in cleaner alternatives. And then to solve this problem, it's been argued that a tax should be levied on economic activities that release pollutants into the environment, making polluters pay for the broader costs that their emissions impose. This creates an economic disincentive to pollute, internalizing the external cost of production. A tax on suffering follows a similar principle. By internalizing the external cost of animal husbandry, farmers will economize on suffering, and theoretically this should disincentivize the creation of suffering, just like a tax on pollution should lead polluters to pollute less than they otherwise would. So some advantages over traditional approaches, such as imposing minimum welfare standards or trusting the market to regulate itself. One is that a tax on suffering doesn't require consumers to be motivated by animal welfare concerns when they're purchasing their groceries. Price-sensitive consumers will either shift their demand to plant-based foods or animal products from farms with higher welfare standards, thus sidestepping the value action gap that I described earlier. Facing lower tax burdens, tax on suffering creates a financial incentive for farmers to actively reduce the harm that animals face at each stage in the rearing process. Farmers who mistreat or neglect farm animals in order to increase their productive output are therefore penalised and disadvantaged compared to their competitors. And this makes concern for animal welfare the game theoretically optimal strategy for success in the market for animal products. We would also expect there to be more research and development into innovative methods that reduce farm animal suffering beyond what's currently possible. A tax would give farmers an economic incentive to fund this research. A tax on suffering is also more adaptive than the traditional approach of regulating farm animal welfare. Regulations often prescribe specific rearing practices, but restricting one type of activity might lead farmers to switch to an unregulated activity with little gains for animal welfare. And also, these prescribed methods aren't always generalizable in a wide variety of different contexts. A tax that tracks suffering would give farmers the freedom to decide how to reduce the suffering of their farm animals using specialized knowledge that they have in order to reduce their tax burden. And then last, we think a tax on suffering is better than other proposals, which use tax as an instrument, such as a tax on meat. These taxes target animal products often, and this is an imperfect proxy for what actually matters, which is preventing suffering or reducing it. Their only effect is to reduce consumer demand for animal products by raising their prices rather than shifting demand over to animal products from animals that suffer less. They also fail to incentivize farmers to reduce suffering in the ways that I've previously described. So this is just like a really brief overview of the tax as we proposed it. But moving on, so yeah, I've argued it would be an effective, adaptive, and desirable policy tool to reduce farm animal suffering, especially compared to existing alternatives. But we would, to implement this tax, we'd need to be able to accurately measure animal suffering wherever it takes place on farms. And this presents some practical challenges, which I'll quickly go over now. So first, to calculate the appropriate tax, we should be able to theoretically quantify suffering, given that it's not a binary state. So as I mentioned before, there's the duration of suffering. We think it's fairly intuitive that the longer the experience of suffering, the more tax the farmer ought to pay. And then secondly, there's the intensity of suffering. Some instances of suffering are experienced as being worse than others. And we think to be effective, a tax on suffering should actually take into account these differences in severity. And yeah, if we multiply these values together, we can get, I guess, a total amount of how much suffering occurs over a given duration. And this could be translated into a taxable sum simply by adding these values together over the course of the tax year. However, there are some hidden theoretical assumptions underpinning these calculations that could drastically impact how the tax would be implemented. So for one, it's common to assume that the distribution scales for hedonic welfare are linear, meaning that they have equal magnitudes of differences between the intervals. And according to this conception, the difference between a 1 out of 5 pain and say a 3 out of 5 pain is 2 units of disvalue. So the latter would be 3 times worse than the former. If we assume a linear scale for quantifying suffering, once we've measured the suffering of a farm animal, the tax will be applied in proportion to this observed difference in magnitude, given the scale. However, we think that it could well be the case that the appropriate scale for measuring suffering is nonlinear, perhaps the long tail, in which case the difference between these two variables could be exponential. To take an extreme example, if suffering or valence follows a log normal distribution pattern, then the latter pain would be about 100 times worse than the former, i.e. 2 orders of magnitude. We don't argue in the paper that a tax on suffering is logarithmic, but we know that this is a possibility given consistent trends in self-reports about the undesirability of peak painful experiences, and also given pain scales that have been developed, for example, to describe the different levels of suffering that occur for insect bites, cluster headaches, spicy food. There's also some other research that we're aware of that has been published in this area, and this would have to be figured out. We'd have to have a scale of the intensity in order to appropriately apply the tax. But yeah, if suffering follows a long tail distribution of some shape, then an effective suffering tax should increase non-linearly with more extreme forms of suffering. Then a second problem is that we have to be able to detect and measure animal suffering on farms. We don't know how many farm animals suffer and how much they suffer. We wouldn't know how much to tax individual farmers. And this raises the enforcement problem that plagues existing methods of regulating animal welfare. So we don't have a complete answer to this question, which would be beyond the scope of our argument, but we suggest 3 possible avenues for future research. So first, we could use methods that have been developed in the field of animal welfare science, where behavioural and physiological markers are often treated as proxies for measuring animal suffering. For example, using blood concentrations of hormones, frequencies of behaviours, changes in heart rate or body temperature, among other such measurable proxies. While there's some disagreement between researchers about the accuracy and reliability of these proxies, especially when engaging in cross-species welfare comparisons, most animal welfare scientists agree that they're sufficient to draw general conclusions about animal welfare. And thus, while improvements to these models are possible, we think a tax could be based on pre-existing knowledge and testing procedures developed by animal welfare scientists. A problem with this approach is its implementation at a large scale on farms. So even if we installed all of the required measuring equipment, there'd just be too many animals for humans to keep track of. A simpler option would be for animal welfare scientists to estimate how much suffering different species of animals might experience under normal circumstances, and then these estimates could be used to apply a tax per animal. However, while this might shift the consumption between different types of animals, it would provide too few incentives for farmers to improve the suffering or the situation of individual animals. So it wouldn't be ideal. A feasible alternative then might be to tax the leading causes of suffering or contributors to animal suffering. So for example, we could get animal welfare scientists to estimate the expected suffering resulting from different rearing methods, and these estimates could be factored into a per head tax. To implement this, we'd only need to match rearing methods with farms, also taking into account the number of animals involved. And yeah, compared to the previous option, this method would not only be cheaper to implement at a large scale, but it would also provide more straightforward incentives for farmers to alter their rearing practices in order to reduce farm animal suffering. But last, we think, or at least we have reason to believe, that our capacity to measure animal suffering will improve with the development of new AI-assisted technologies. So for example, hypothetically, we could use basic sensors installed on farms, such as video cameras or thermal cameras and microphones, and then we could program computer systems to automatically identify and record when farm animals are in distress, including small changes to, say, their facial expressions, their body temperature, vocalizations, among other such signals. This data could then be processed using species-specific machine learning algorithms that have been trained and validated by animal welfare scientists to predict how much individual animals are suffering and also from what cause. Conditional on certain inferred causes, the system could then impose the appropriate tax. So this is more speculative than the previous options, but we believe that it would be the most effective method for imposing a suffering tax, simply because, yeah, it can be scaled up and we can improve the predictive power of the algorithms with more data. And yeah, once the system's installed, also the ongoing costs would be marginal. It would require only the basic maintenance of surveillance equipment. And we also note that similar systems have been successfully developed to, say, monitor the spread of disease in wild animal populations, and have also been proposed to decode animal communication. There's no reason to think that they couldn't also be developed for the purposes of monitoring animal welfare and detecting and measuring suffering on farms. So moving on, the fourth part of this presentation, some ethical objections that might be raised against this proposal. So first of all, an ethical challenge could be proposed that it's unfair that consumers must bear the cost of animal suffering, since there'd be no farm animals without demand for animal products. Consumers are responsible for bringing animals into existence, and when these lives are worth living, consumers benefit animals and thus shouldn't be held responsible for mitigating their suffering. However, we think this isn't an argument against a tax on suffering in situations where animals lead lives that are not worth living, i.e. prudentially net negative, which plausibly describes the majority of factory farms that exist. And even if this wasn't the case, we also think it's implausible that the only thing consumers owe to animals is that they bring animals, when they bring them into existence, is to ensure that their lives are barely worth living. To take an example, we wouldn't be satisfied if a dog owner used the same reasoning to justify beating their dog on the assumption that their lifetime welfare was net positive. If we're willing to accept also that procreators have special duties to their offspring, it might also follow that consumers have special procreative duties to protect farm animals from harm, given that they wouldn't exist if not for consumer demand. A tax on suffering works better than other policy tools because it explicitly recognises these special duties that might result from procreation. It would be unfair to tax everyone equally in response to harm that's just caused by a few. And moreover, we think that it would be unfair to tax occasional consumers of animal products the same amount as regular or frequent consumers of animal products. So yeah, it should be proportional. A tax on suffering works better than other policy tools because it explicitly recognises, sorry, I was following the same notes. Okay, consumers don't make a difference. Another reason to object to this tax is maybe based on the notion each individual consumer plays an insignificant role in contributing toward animal suffering. So the number of animals that come into existence is plausibly unaffected by the actions of an individual consumer, and maybe it's unfair to hold consumers individually responsible for this problem as a result. It's actually possible also that many consumers are aware of their insignificance and maybe continue to consume animal products on this basis, in which case they shouldn't be held liable for the costs. But yeah, it would be difficult to, we think, to argue that each individual is insignificant when it's clear that the sum of all individuals makes a significant change. Yeah, the sum of these contributions can't suddenly become significant unless individual contributions have an effect. It might be difficult and maybe even like impossible or intractable to determine whether a given consumer of animal products is directly causally responsible for bringing an animal into existence, but it doesn't follow from this that consumers are rationally allowed to act as if their actions have no effect. So assuming that consumers have this responsibility, one could ask whether a tax on suffering unfairly penalises farmers who are only doing the bidding of consumers. Such a tax would likely raise the average price of animal products, making farmers worse off on average if consumer demand shrinks, which it plausibly would, because animal products would be more expensive. However, if causing excess suffering is morally objectionable, then farmers shouldn't be complicit in this practice, regardless of whether it happens to be legal at the time of their operations. The fact that certain business practices have been legal in the past does not present a very good reason for them to continue operating unrestricted if we discover that they're responsible for causing harm. While it might be unfortunate that some farms might go out of business as a result of implementing this tax, we think it doesn't override our moral duties toward farm animals. And moreover, while most farmers might be made worse off by this tax if they're engaging in intensive farming practices, we actually expect that those who already treat their animals well would be benefited, leveling the playing field. So a tax on suffering theoretically would reward existing moral behaviour, as more ethical farmers will receive a greater share of consumer demand in the market for animal products. All right, so moving on. Following this line of reasoning, one might object that a suffering tax undermines each farmer's rights to privacy. As I noted before, implementing this tax in ideal circumstances would require the constant surveillance of farm animals, and usually we think that people are protected from surveillance by a right to privacy, which is violated by this policy. In response, we note that the right to privacy is not absolute and is recognised as being compatible with surveillance in many established contexts. Other pressing concerns, such as the protection of vulnerable subjects, can circumvent it. Animals are vulnerable subjects. Animals have no power to protect themselves from human mistreatment on farms, and nor can they even protest their injuries for recompense. Although farmers have legal property rights to their animals, animals are not mere things to be used however the farmer likes. This is widely recognised and evident from existing animal welfare regulations, which can be understood as society's method of constraining property rights concerning animals. Active surveillance and a tax on suffering would only build upon these constraints. So next, one could object that to this tax on the basis that it's repugnant to economise on suffering. For example, if someone created a market where people could pay extra to inflict more suffering on animals, this would seemingly be wrong or just like morally undesirable. A tax on suffering, it could be argued, is morally objectionable on the same basis. Maybe we shouldn't be economising on something that's bad. However, we think a tax on suffering and a market for animal suffering are not analogous. A tax is a policy instrument that is designed to make it costly to harm animals, and it therefore expresses a weak form of condemnation. It allows farmers and consumers to continue to inflict suffering as long as they pay the price to compensate for the harm that their actions cause. And in contrast, a market for animal suffering would only serve to incentivize the creation of additional animal suffering. A tax on suffering is better in this respect than existing animal welfare regulations, which permit all instances of suffering beyond a certain threshold, or up to a certain threshold, I should say. Compared to these regulations, a tax at least penalises all instances of suffering, and while it allows for paying for suffering, it does not subsidise it, nor does it make it costless for consumers. It's also helpful to distinguish between individual and political morality here. For not all morally wrong actions we think should be prohibited or punished by the state. It might be wrong to buy animal products from animals that have suffered more under this system, just as it could be wrong to emit an excessive amount of CO2, even if one pays carbon taxes. And yeah, finally, I'll just return to what I said at the beginning of this presentation. I noted that our argument proceeds on the assumption that what's wrong with animal farming is the suffering that it causes, rather than the act of farming animals itself. But suppose that abolitionists are correct and that the ideal state is one in which no animals are owned and exploited. While a tax on suffering might improve the situation of animals on the margin, one could argue that this is worse in the long run because it makes the ultimate goal of abolishing animal husbandry less likely to occur. People who are opposed to animal husbandry usually argue on the grounds that farm animals are treated poorly, and if a tax on suffering improves the conditions of farm animals, then the coalition in favour of abolishing animal husbandry could lose force. However, we know that this objection equally applies to existing animal welfare regulations. If a tax on animal suffering is objectionable because it reduces the pressure to abolish animal husbandry, so do existing regulations. It would also give us a pro tanto argument for increasing animal suffering if this increases the posterior likelihood that humans will one day revolt against the system. And we think this is absurd, or at the very least counterintuitive. Moreover, there's very little evidence to support this empirical assumption that the worse animals fare, the more we'll push to end their subjugation. It's very plausible that targeted policies aimed at improving animal welfare also facilitate their increased moral consideration, and indeed, many animal advocates and charities follow this strategy when pursuing policy reform. Our proposal is therefore in line with existing approaches to animal advocacy, however unconventional it might seem. That's everything. We have, email addresses and websites if anybody wants to contact us for further info, and I guess now we can kind of move on to the questions. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks, Asher. No, it's not time for the questions. It's time for Andy's comments, response, objections, or whatever you have to say. So, cool. Andy, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you all so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Amazing. So thanks so much, Asher and Aksel, and thanks also to Diego for inviting me. I'm truly honored to be here to discuss this really important contribution. So for those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I'm Andy Stawasz. I'm a legal fellow at the Institute for Policy Integrity at New York University School of Law. And for about a year and a half, I served as an advisor in the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which largely oversees American executive branch agencies, benefit cost analyses. And I also had the honor of serving in the inaugural class with Brooks Institute Emerging Scholars Fellows, which focuses on promoting animal law scholarship. So I've done a lot of thinking about the economics of regulation and about animal suffering. So I was really thrilled to hear about this interesting and important proposal to tax animal suffering. I should say at the top that I'm here on my own behalf. Nothing I say should be taken to represent the views of NYU School of Law, the Institute for Policy Integrity, any of the other organizations I mentioned. But to begin, there's a lot I really, really like about the paper. I think it diagnoses a real problem, that animals matter morally, that markets don't reflect that, and that leaves incentives to take actions that most of us agree are morally wrong, like subjecting farm animals to huge amounts of pain for comparatively little marginal benefit. In fact, my main nitpick about how you diagnose the problem is that you may not go far enough. The quoted estimate of 80 billion terrestrial vertebrate farmed animals being slaughtered annually for food is lower than the latest FAO estimate, which is 92.2 billion. But any of these figures is a gross underestimate, as they all ignore farmed fish and other aquatic animals, who have no less of a claim to moral standing than terrestrial farmed animals. But point being, given that progress is not coming in fast enough for these many harmed animals, I deeply appreciate the need to explore innovative policy approaches to righting this wrong, and a Pagovian tax to make farms internalize the harms they impose fits the bill. I also appreciate that the paper in this proposal is largely conceptual, with many critically important questions to be answered in later work. I appreciate the need to develop the proposal incrementally like that, and I actually applaud that the proposal doesn't let conceptually difficult, but in principle solvable problems stand in the way of proposal solutions. So my main suggestions for this proposal fit into two general buckets: small tweaks and maybe deeper food for thought. So to start with the small tweaks, first, you have identified one problem with welfare regulations rightly, which is under-enforcement. I'd say another problem, at least in the United States, I have to imagine many other places, is weak standards to begin with. For instance, in the United States, there's no general farmed animal welfare law. There's a law that applies to farmed animals at slaughter, but it doesn't apply to most slaughtered animals, including poultry and fish. And it doesn't protect even the covered animals, like cows and pigs, until they're actually slaughtered, i.e. for most of their lives. Second, it's not totally clear to me why the claim that taxes on meat and animal products or relatedly subsidies for animal welfare couldn't shift demand over to animal products from animals that suffer less. Well, why not? Why not design these taxes and subsidies so that they do capture that effect? It doesn't seem like an inherently impossible thing to do. Like if cattle suffer less than chickens, then we tax beef less or subsidize it more than chicken. Or beef cattle reared in way X suffer more than those reared in way Y, then tax the beef reared using way X more. On that front, I also might add in a dimension of administrability. There might be an administrability argument for those alternatives. For instance, there's basically, again, at least in the United States, no oversight on farms to confirm where suffering is occurring. This is made worse by ag-gag laws insofar as those are legal, which are being promoted left and right in the United States, Canada, and perhaps elsewhere. You know how difficult oversight is in the context of under-enforced animal welfare regulations. It's true that AI can fill this gap some, but inevitably incompletely. You still need to get the cameras into the facilities, which are promoting, again, ag-gag laws and don't embrace transparency. I might say it's simply easier to tax product classes rather than heterogeneous producers, which could reduce transaction costs by a huge amount and get us, perhaps, the argument goes, close enough to the world you want to be worth pursuing. Third, this is maybe a small point, but you do argue that farmers do have property rights to their animals, but animals are not mere things that can be treated however the farmer likes. I agree that that's wildly attractive as a normative statement, but it does stand in the face of a good deal of case law, at least in the United States, again, holding exactly the opposite, especially for farmed animals, and even when it produces heart-wrenching consequences, undercompensating dog owners for losing their friend and family member, for example, since it's mere property. Fourth, in the United States, at least, the people who own the animals, and then thus, as I understand it, would be subject to the tax, are often not the same as the people raising the animals. People like Tyson will contract out the raising of their animals to an independent farmer. Just worth thinking about how would you align the incentives so that each person is paying for their fair share of the harm that they inflict. And fifth, it's not totally clear to me how the big actors would be hurt if the large farms, the Tysons and Smithfields, would pass on the cost to consumers, given their market power, or onto those other smaller farmers who, as you point out, are relatively poor, don't have many other options, and are not perhaps inherently bad people, but are subject to the sort of market forces that that come from the world that these big farms have largely created. Many might say, and it might be worth thinking about, this lets the ones driving much of this terrible system off the hook relatively scot-free, while the low-level individuals operating in this world that they created bear the brunt of the burdens this tax might impose. That could be seen as a somewhat regressive or perhaps unfair way to apportion the relative burden. Now on to just a couple of bigger, higher-level thoughts. As I understand it, the point of the Pagovian tax is to correct suboptimal resource allocation by forcing someone who's hurting others to experience that harm themselves. If we tax producing secondhand smoke at the dollar value of all the health harms that smokers impose on others, then smokers would be forced to experience all the harms themselves and would only smoke at the socially optimal level, so the argument goes. That level may not be zero. Indeed, for a lot of external harms, including GHGs, like you mentioned, those won't be. Like, no one, despite the GHG, local pollution, and other externalities, not no one, but very few people are suggesting we should use zero electricity, despite its externalities. Rather, there's a socially optimal non-zero level of harm that we're willing to tolerate. So, what's the optimal non-zero level of suffering we're after here? More to the point, how do we think about answering that question? I'm not sure from the discussion what the goal is besides less animal suffering. In fact, the suggestion at the end of a paper that was shared with me is to set the tax at an arbitrary but low level and sort of raise it up from there. But based on what? And I wonder, when do we stop? Now, you don't have to answer, we stop on this date or at this number of units of suffering, but how would we think about these questions? And relatedly, once we solve, some practical problems with putting human and animal suffering into, let's say, constant, morally weighted terms, how do we price animal suffering? In other words, if we knew that a chicken suffered 100 units and a pig suffered 150 units, how do we do know that the tax related to the pig that should be 1.5 times as big as that for the chicken, assuming these scale linearly. But what's the dollar value per unit? Now, I grant that we can leave some practical problems, and we should leave some practical problems for future research. But to me, this might not be so much a practical problem as a definitional problem that gets at the real contours of the tax itself. Just stating, even in the abstract, what the precise goal is, what the optimal state of the world is, how suffering should be priced, or even how to think about all that, might help readers understand exactly what the proposed tax is, even though some precise numbers and implementation details can come later. And then I would add that maybe fundamentally the paper might do well to address head-on some high-level questions you might see from skeptical readers. As you probably know, in all but a few jurisdictions, animals don't have legal standing, and in all but the most limited of cases, they don't have formal political or policy standing. Now, true that politicians and voters at times support pro-animal legislation, but there's no way to show that that doesn't owe to voters' own selfish preferences for peace of mind, warm glow, not having to think about all the hurt animals and the like. And that, could be why these policies still, as you observe, leave a huge, sort of morally repugnant amount of residual suffering. It's not obvious from this state of the world that political systems owe anything to animals for their own sake. Maybe they should, normatively. In fact, I do think that political systems ought to act for animals' own sakes. That doesn't mean, as a positive description of how the law is, that they do. In fact, you draw kind of a reasonable distinction between moral wrongs and legal wrongs, which kind of get at this difference. But you might say that this tax is valid only if governments owe something to animals for their own sake, that animals have political or policy standing. So it might be worth thinking, how would you overcome that? We might also say that, relatedly, animals have no economic standing, and that economics, and therefore any policies based on economics, like the Pagovian tax, don't capture non-human animals' interests. Again, maybe it should, but right now, arguably, so the argument goes, it doesn't. So how might you get around that issue? And I might go a step further. This tax would give animals something that the law doesn't provide even for its human constituents. Even a casual glance at a lot of the suffering that happens to humans suggests that there's no Pigovian tax on human suffering. A rough approximations in some context, but it's far from absolute, and there's, in fact, very clearly no tax on making farmers or slaughterhouse workers suffer. Might it be a stretch, so the argument goes, to say that the law owes something to farmed animals that it doesn't provide for the humans alongside them? Now, these questions, to be very clear, might be answerable, but they might deserve some attention, lest you leave behind some skeptical readers unnecessarily. But to reiterate, this is an exciting paper that I'm super glad somebody, and you smart people in particular, are working on. So congratulations, thanks again, and I really look forward to it.
Cool. Amazing.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, now we'll open the floor to questions. Alistair was first. I don't know if you still have a question, Alistair.
And also just before we do, also Aksel is present in the audience, and so if anyone has a question more for Aksel, then yeah, he can help.
Yeah, Alistair, do you still have a question?
Yeah, I do actually. Thanks, Diego. I am kind of repeating a couple of things Andy said, but I would like to hear the answers, so I may as well just do it in brief. One of which is there a floor of suffering which that animals can't fall below, right? So this is the end of those countries that do have animal welfare laws. So anything goes. So you can have your foie gras, your veal, you can have your tortured animals as long as you're willing to pay the cost. That seems just problematic to me. It seems problematic, like intrinsically, but also kind of symbolically, that yeah, you can do anything you like to a farmed animal as long as you're willing to pay the price. So that seems problematic. And then the other thing is also, given your kind of formula for how we determine how much suffering, how to measure suffering, duration seems important. I guess that also comes in part entails duration of life. So shorter lives is better, less taxed. So we should just, there'll be a massive shift for farmers raising lambs, for example, rather than say beef cattle. Anyway, just a couple of things. Like I said, Andy kind of touched on these two.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Regarding the first question, is there a floor? Is there a floor for the worst instances of suffering that might be permitted if we got rid of the minimum welfare standards? I think you could advocate for a hybrid approach, like if we all agreed that there are certain kind of like acts that are just like impermissible, regardless of how much a producer is willing to pay, then there could be like certain kind of like I guess like kind of categorical farmers cannot engage in these practices, and then the tax on suffering could just deal with like more moderate to mild forms of suffering. However, I would expect that if suffering is logarithmic in nature, or if, at least if the scales upon which we should measure valence is logarithmic, then really the most extreme forms of suffering just might not be like might not be economically viable for anyone other than like multimillionaires. you could expect. Even then, it could still be the case that we have these rules against certain slaughter or rearing practices. And also regarding the point about shorter lives being better, this is also a good objection. I hadn't actually considered this. It could be that this would incentivize like raising animals in order for them to, animals are already, I guess, like selectively bred to have shorter lives than they would be living naturally, and to put on more meat. And this generally causes more suffering. I like to think that even if it led to, maybe, lamb being consumed more than adult for animals turned into meat, I like to think that maybe it would create a selection pressure to selectively breed animals to suffer less, in which case then it would just be a matter of deciding at which point in the animal's life we should slaughter the animal. But actually, it would directly, I guess, deal with what seems to be disvaluable or harmful. But maybe this is like, not a take that would be super intuitive, and maybe others would disagree. But yeah, Axel, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so maybe just a short. So I've been thinking in a previous paper, thinking about like whether you could combine a tax on suffering with a tax on death to create like a more optimal level. So if you really care about deprivation, right, and you think that's bad, and in this paper we just set that aside. We're like, okay, killing might be bad, and deprivation of future lifespan might be bad, but we just like gonna ignore that for now. But if you take that into account and you think that's important, and it probably is, then you need some kind of other instrument. I think you can learn something from the quality adjusted life year or the disability adjusted life year literature in health economics, where you get this kind of actually combined metric that you can use even for animals. So that's a possibility. I guess I think it's also interesting. It seems like the natural thing to do is, as you said, to combine on your first question, to combine the tax with some kind of minimum level. And that could be at like barely worth living, for example. So it's clearly impermissible to bring an animal into existence if it lives a life that is net negative, and that should be prohibited. And then you just add the tax on top of that. That seems plausible. You might also, and that could be for the intrinsic value of the animal, right? If you really care about the animal, that would be a thing to do. But you can also add something if you really care. So Jason Lusk has this paper on like an animal welfare market, and he says loads of us we have this willingness to pay to prevent people from imposing massive suffering on other on animals. So we might think that if we could actually channel this preference for preventing people from having foie gras or other kind of like despicable consumer habits, we would want to pay them to stop doing that, and maybe policy should reflect that willingness to pay. So that would be another way of thinking about that question, taking into account like our preference about other people's consumption.
Good. Niels?
Right. Hi everyone. Asher, nice to see you present this. Asher et al. I could also, like Andrew, I'll point out that I'll just comment from an independent point of view. Or I mean, nobody's independent, but I'm not speaking for an organization, so I'm just coming from an economics background, and as such, my remarks will also be more on the taxing itself, for example. As you were presenting, I was thinking, at which scale would you think this would be implemented? Because if you do it, every state is a sovereign state and can choose whether or not to implement such a tax. And it will usually be the countries that already have a kind of high standard for animal welfare and inspection that will be willing to look or consider even such taxes. And the countries maybe that are, for example, don't yet have a big middle class, those countries will maybe be less interested. And similarly, GHG was mentioned earlier on. I think the dynamics are similar in that regard, that countries that, for example, still have a big poor population will not be incentivized much to care about having animal welfare or decreasing GHG. And let's say the countries that are lower on the Maslow pyramid, if you want to put it like that, those will be maybe less incentivized to implement such taxes. So if you want this to work, you would have to kind of work like they did with the Kyoto Protocol, very internationally, and sort of try to get countries to sign up for this. Because if it's going to be international or national efforts, I don't think it's really you're going to be very effective. And the second thing that I was thinking, as we always try to make things better, sometimes we humans complicate things, like adding things to a system.
It's 17 hours.
Oh, sorry for that. That's my laptop. Here in Netherlands, it's 1700 hours. No, sometimes we complicate things more if we try to address certain issues. And maybe it's sometimes also good to take away from systems. So here we want to add taxes. But at least if I speak for Netherlands, which I know most about, I'm from there, and having grown up in the more rural areas, I know there's quite some inspection on farms here that's already there. So like I think Alice there said it, maybe it doesn't make sense to put a tax on suffering, thereby kind of allowing or condoning the suffering. But if there's already inspection, which at least in the Netherlands, kind of, let's say, high in the Maslow pyramid, if there is already inspection, why not just rely on that system that's already in place and just shut down the farms that do not meet the requirements? And then yes, you can maybe finesse the let's say the variables that are checked for inspection that are already in place. Maybe you can finesse them more with your formula or whatever we find in animal welfare research. But maybe you don't have to add a tax, because it will just make things more expensive for everyone. And indeed, it would kind of condone animal suffering and just put a price on it. So you mentioned that already in your maybe moral problem with this proposal, but it triggered that thought for me as well. And taxes on death, as Aksel mentioned, also triggered a thought for me. The interest of a death of an animal and the interest is already aligned with the farmer, because for the farmer, a death of or premature death of an animal is also a cost. So maybe you don't, it's already kind of aligned interests that the farmer wants to take care of animals. In that sense, at least when it comes to death, maybe there is already aligned interest. So, that was just some thoughts I had on your presentation.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, thank you for turning up. It's good to see you. Yeah, there's some really great questions. I don't really have an answer to the first one. Maybe I'll hand that over to Aksel if you have anything to say, or.
Let's see. At least I thought you were going somewhere else. I thought you were going to say like, okay, so states will compete with other states. So you have the most animal-friendly countries, and they impose this tax, and then they'll just start importing, like meat from other countries.
Race to the bottom with normal taxes.
Possibly, right? And I think that could probably be solved by putting some kind of import toll or something, like an import tariff. I think that would be possible. I think to your, maybe the question you actually asked, I think it just seems like you have a bit more of a rosy picture of the welfare of animals and maybe how farmers are treating animals. And I think it's probably better in the Netherlands. I'm from Norway. We also think that we're treating our animals well. I think it's not that well. So even, so I think it's just like a regular part of animal husbandry, even in countries like ours. And we treat animals, at least we impose a significant amount of suffering, and that isn't captured by the current laws, the animal welfare laws. And it seems implausible that we'll see any change in that in any time soon. So I think this is like a good complement. And also to your death tax point, right? So yeah, to a certain extent, and that's true for animal suffering as well. There's like some kind of alignment or preference between farmers and the animals. But that alignment is clearly it's just probably like a 10% or something alignment. So, and a cow, for example, can live like 20 years or something, and it's killed after 3.5 years. So clearly it's not like full alignment, and that's true for all the other animals as well. So they die much earlier than they would in natural circumstances. So I think it's like we need some additional instruments. Even though there's like alignment towards alignment, we need to go even further if you take into account intrinsic value of the animals.
And eventually, don't you think this is eventually just going to be a normative societal kind of application of the tax? Because in the Netherlands, for example, there was a big mink industry, just like in Denmark. I don't know for Norway. And this has been recently actually sped up by COVID, because there was supposedly transmission risk. But this was already prohibited anyways, but these farms that shut down in the Netherlands have been mostly moved to Poland, Russia, and countries where there's actually a lack of legislation. So there's again like an example where there will be actually increased animal suffering as a result of this legislation. That's why I said earlier, maybe you would really have to capture this internationally with, I don't know how.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah,
that's a good point.
Yeah, I'll turn my video on my laptop because I think there's a bit of a lag up there. But yeah, in response to the other points that you were making, one of the reasons why I like this idea of taxing suffering is that it seems like if it could be implemented right, if you could set the tax at the right amount, and you had like you solved the problem of having different nations with different legal systems all cooperating, it seems like it would really just simplify the problem to a large extent, because the current state, I mean, also, you guys mentioned, the Netherlands and Norway see themselves as having good animal welfare. This is also a thing in New Zealand. New Zealand is, I mean, I think actually like these countries probably do have just better animal welfare than a lot of other countries, but, and maybe it wouldn't, maybe what you said before, maybe this wouldn't apply to kind of smaller farms where it's determined that there's not a significant amount of suffering occurring, or it's kind of like the scale isn't as significant. Maybe there could be again another sort of hybrid system. Maybe if you have below a certain number of animals, or depending on the species of animals that's being farmed, then maybe you could decide whether or not you just have the regular kind of animal welfare inspector visiting the farm as a means of enforcing certain standards, or if it's like a ginormous factory farm with hundreds of thousands of chickens or something like that, then that would be a lot better to apply a tax in that case. So yeah, it's possible that there are kind of in between solutions, but I also really take your point about not wanting to overcomplicate a tax system, and also just you don't want to incentivize kind of or push the problem onto another country and not really solve it at a global scale. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Jose.
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Nice. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I have 4 questions. Perhaps some of them have already been asked because I couldn't hear Andrew properly, so maybe he raised the points already. But my first question is, you have answered it, but I didn't understand properly the reason. My question is, why are you taxing suffering and not harms, more generally understood? And before you mentioned death, I think it's super important to answer that question at the beginning, because if you only tax, I mean, the harm of death in animals under what I see a plausible conception of death is tremendous, especially since you guys have already mentioned the point that, generally speaking, animals don't live, let's say, don't live the time or the lifespan they are supposed to live, right? So that's my first question. Assuming as well as that you assume that death is a harm, perhaps you don't think that way. So my second question is why you are taxing suffering or harms if you take into account death, and not animal exploitation, generally speaking. That's kind of, I think that you addressed that when you mentioned the abolitionist point. I didn't really understand that point. If you could please repeat it, I'd appreciate it. My third question is, you put the analogy of suffering as an externality with pollution. My question here is, so there are a lot of proposals that say that the taxes that you get from pollution are invested in alleviating or compensating the harms of those affected by pollution. Okay, so my question is, are you applying this same method or this same investment of taxes, or are you thinking another thing? If you're thinking in compensating the individuals affected by that harm, I don't know, perhaps just first blush, it seems super problematic, because what do? Should you increase the suffering, and with the tax, you give them, whatever they like, and you keep that going on and going on? But at the end of the day, the animal probably will have a bad life. So it's kind of, there's a tension there, it seems to me. Yes. Or maybe you think, no, that tax is not going to alleviate or compensate that animal, but therefore the analogy with externality of the pollution doesn't work, because under plausible conceptions of what you do with the taxes that you get from pollution, you do that to compensate them. I don't know. My final question is, no, actually there's two more, sorry. The fourth is, so as you know, workers that work in factory farms suffer from a lot of stress. Usually there's, drug problems and so on. So there's a lot of suffering there. And if you are concerned with taxing animal suffering in regards, or in order to, in some distant future, abolish that, or let's say that the animal market decreases it and it disappears, why don't you tax as well human suffering in the factory farming environment? And my final question is, when you raised the moral objections, you said that one objection was that perhaps these practical measures would invade the privacy rights of the farmers. And your reply was that that could be done if it is going to protect vulnerable subjects. My question is, why don't you think that would apply as well to the debate of, surveillance equipments to vigilate parents, the case of children, or domesticated animals, to state the case of in animals as well, or people with disabilities. All these people are under discretionary control of the people that take care of them. So I think you need to address that. And I think that's all. Thank you very much, and I hope that weren't too many questions.
Yeah, cool. I might not remember all of them, but I'll try my best. So just like immediately going after the last one, I guess my approach to animal ethics is generally, welfare and interest-based, and it doesn't seem like animals have that much of an interest in privacy, in the same sense, at least, that humans do. That would kind of that grounds having privacy rights. And so I guess like I don't have like a clear answer, but I would assume that there's a good argument to suggest that we should kind of treat these beings differently. What you were saying about like where would the funds go? So yeah, you're right to point out that they wouldn't be probably distributed to the animal. I would kind of like going off Peter Singer's equal consideration of interests. Animals obviously don't have bank accounts, and I don't think it would be very rational or very reasonable to say that we should be giving animals bank accounts and sending them the funds that would result from this tax. They don't have a need for it. I would rather say that probably the funds could be one of the problems that we identified that results in there being so much suffering is that it costs money to change a factory farm, or to change the rearing conditions for animals to reduce their suffering or improve their welfare. And at the moment, this isn't like priced into the market for animal products. But if you had a tax, or if you had like an income stream that was like intrinsically tied to the market, then this could like go into not only just like improving their living conditions, but I think it could also go into research on like understanding actually the physical nature of suffering is like something that I'm quite optimistic about. Like I think we're still relying on proxies. We still can't directly measure this thing. And on the assumption that it's real and that it can be actually directly measured, we just don't have the right technology or the right conceptual tools to develop the technology. Funding this kind of research could actually just result in massive improvements in the future, not only for our capacity to like measure suffering, but just directly reduce it and give animals much better lives. There was something I was going to say but I've forgotten. I think there were quite a few questions, but maybe Aksel, do you have any responses to those questions or?
Yeah, and I can combine. So thank you also to Andy for amazing questions and comments, and we benefit from your work while working on this paper. So I can say something about what you both talked about, like why not also have a tax on suffering for humans? So it seems to be workers in some of these farms that really suffer from that. So shouldn't we also have a tax on suffering? And I guess like the naive economist answer would just be to say, well, at least humans engage in mutually beneficial transaction. They accept the cost to themselves for a salary, while obviously animals don't, right? So they're just like the product. So that kind of externality on the animals need to be taxed, while for humans that's not the case. But if you had a negative externality on other humans, such as pollution, etc., we would have that, or we would at least like advocate that kind of tax, and that would be perfectly in line. We wouldn't call it a tax on suffering, but we could call that a tax on suffering, at least if they had a willingness to pay. And that would go beyond this discussion, but of course you could say, well, if suffering is measured in terms of willingness to pay, it seems to be biased towards the rich. So we need some kind of compensatory scheme, or we need to have a willingness to pay measure that is like discounted for wealth levels or something to come closer to suffering. But that's probably beyond the paper. I just want to say something to Andy's. I think especially your moral objections, if there are moral objections, about like what is the optimal non-zero level of suffering, is a really difficult one. And the same thing about like, yeah, I guess you had this kind of thing comparing pigs and chickens. I see that as like partly the same question. So what is optimal level? And I think it depends on contested views in population ethics. So you can have one position which would be like a total sum utilitarian view, which basically would say you shouldn't raise the level, you shouldn't raise the tax more than to come to a level where basically you have like low, so you basically get to some kind of repugnant conclusion, right? Where you shouldn't just at least like have a very high tax, because that would prevent further animals from coming into existence. So what you want is, that would be one view. You could say, put the tax at whatever level maximizes happiness among animals, because there needs to be, so we've obviously focused on suffering in this paper, but clearly it must be a possibility to say at some level, say, this animal has so many good experiences. So yeah, there is some suffering, but that can be obviously be compensated for the benefits. Some people would be hardcore, they'd be have this kind of asymmetry view in population ethics and say, well, you should only count the suffering. So as long as there will be suffering in an animal's life, it's wrong to bring an animal into existence. But that would be a level that would not be, we would never apply that level or that kind of view onto the human situation. So I think at least we're like hinting at some kind of sufficient, like a kind of like a critical level or critical level utilitarianism or something as like one plausible view that would be aligned with what we argue in this paper. But so this is like very difficult, and what we're saying in a way is like partly a cop-out, is saying these are difficult questions in population ethics, but for practical purposes, what we need to do is basically just get the system started, and then we just need to raise the price from there. And then hopefully, I guess, a different response, rather than to have this kind of moral philosophers coming down from up high and saying, this is the optimal theory for population ethics and we'll apply this rule onto society. We might say, let's have a debate in society, and now we measure all the suffering. So we see the suffering that is happening. We get to see the cost this will impose on the consumers, and we're going to have this discussion whether this is reasonable and whether we need to raise the tax. So we get this kind of a structured debate basically for these kind of questions. And that's like a less of like a rigorous philosophical answer, but it's probably something closer to how normal political processes work.
And one more thing to add, just in response to the earlier questions. I just remembered one of my replies, or one of the questions was talking about like different forms of harm that aren't directly related to animal suffering. And yeah, this is a good point. Obviously, like there are different. This is actually a big part of my doctoral thesis, is looking at different theories of animal welfare and animal welfare science and theories of well-being that we usually apply to humans, looking at the overlap between them. There are different like accounts of what welfare is, and many theorists, both in philosophy and animal welfare science, will argue that actually, what is non-instrumental to well-being is not just like reducible to hedonic welfare. And so, yeah, if you take these views seriously, then maybe we're missing out something with the tax. I guess like, yeah, I think there's a broad argument you could make, which is at the very least in animal welfare science, a lot of the accounts of animal welfare are like explicitly kind of acknowledged by the people that like came up with these accounts as like, oh, these are just like, yeah, basically the hedonic welfare is kind of like the grounding, and then these other things are just like broadly kind of tracking hedonic welfare. So yeah, I guess like a more hedonistic or suffering focused view is more common, looking at the situation of farmed animals at the very least. But yeah, otherwise, like maybe, yeah, if you take these alternative, especially like philosophical views of well-being seriously and you apply them to animals, yeah, it could be the case that there are sources of negative welfare that aren't just being tracked when we're, only kind of disincentivizing the creation of suffering. And yeah, I guess I'd just say there are broad correlations between what different philosophers consider to be like prudentially like bad and also prudentially good, but more so for prudentially bad. And so at the very least, you could say a suffering tax could be a proxy for these other things that are bad. But yeah.
Good. Andy next.
So I just have a scattershot of like thoughts that have emerged from this discussion for what it's worth. First is a response to something Niels said. Niels framed some things in terms of alignment of interests between animals and farmers in some cases, especially when it comes to premature death. But I would say, just to avoid, just to disambiguate two things, there's a difference between having interests correlate and missing some of the absolute value of one party's interests. For example, I as a consumer might have some interest in, like shutting the lights off when I leave a room, driving less, because that lowers my energy bill and my gas bill and all of that. But when you factor in how much people in developing countries who are suffering from climate change would want me to shut off my lights and, drive my car less and all of that, our interests correlate in that we both want me to drive a little less, but their collective willingness to pay is clearly an externality that is not captured in my individual decision-making until there's a tax. So having a correlation is not sufficient for it being captured, I would just say. And I would say the same about farmers' interest in avoiding premature mortality in the affected animals' interest. It's kind of the same. Just a quick thought on something Jose raised on grounding privacy rights. It's true that animals don't have privacy rights, but I guess the more relevant question is whether the farmers do. I can fully buy that animals don't have privacy rights, even if some humans do, and still think that this is, just to steelman the opposition, still think that this is a problem. And then, I think in response to something Aksel said, in response to something Jose said, why not use the tax for animals' interests? I mean, we don't need to give, sorry, maybe Asher said this, forgive me, I'm getting confused. But we don't need to necessarily give animals bank accounts. But what about trusts run by humans, set up in their name? What about an animal welfare board? What about just hiring more FTEs? What about, I don't know, if we are not, married to being farm animals, habitat conservation? I don't know. This doesn't seem like a totally insane and intractable. Yeah, the details are hard, but not conceptually impossible to use it for animals' benefits. Just in response to something Aksel just said, it's true that humans engage in mutually beneficial transactions. I would maybe nuance that a bit and say Homo economicus engages in mutually beneficial transactions. But here there's the presence of a good amount of market power, a lot of residual suffering among, let's say, slaughterhouse workers, suggesting that this may not be a totally free bargain. Representative examples, facts in the US, more deaths per capita among slaughterhouse workers than among cops, firefighters, and sailors. You know, another factoid, one of the government agencies most worried about factory farms is the antitrust wing of the Department of Justice. Just, you know, food for thought, this is not necessarily a free bargain. You know, I'm not sure we've quite crossed that bridge fully. On the optimal level of suffering, you know, one answer just to consider, why not bring animals into the market that economists are modeling? You know, then the answer becomes the same as it is for humans. I mean, it's generally something like efficiency, where marginal benefits of your last act equal the marginal cost of that act. For correcting externalities, we use Coasium bargaining. Now, it's weird to think of animals like engaging in the marketplace, but why not? I mean, they have preferences, they express those preferences. They have the presence of and different magnitudes for preferences, they trade off. You know, there's studies on the amount of tasty feed that chickens will trade for more enrichment. I mean, this is, again, really hard to get into the same terms, but, you know, just at a conceptual level, maybe the answer is no different for humans on the one hand, and humans plus animals on the other hand. What the market deems the efficient outcome, maybe. And then just on one point that hasn't come up yet, you know, you pointed out the counter argument that consumers don't make a difference. I just want to steel man it a little bit. It can be possible that one consumer doesn't make a difference, but the sum of consumers does. I mean, you know, the silly analogy is, think about someone standing at the bottom of a hill. There's a truck on the top of the hill, and the truck only moves and falls down the hill when 5 people push on the truck, right? One person can't be held responsible because they weren't sufficient to push the truck down the hill, but you know, the collection of all 5 of the people pushing the truck down the hill and killing one person, you know, that's the sort of steelman version of that argument. Now, I think that you can get out of this empirically, because the research, as I understand it, suggests that in the meat market, the market signals are strong, where less demand translates to less supply, more or less 1-to-1, at least in the United States. Again, sorry, but American lawyer, I know nothing about anywhere else, as with every single American lawyer, but just, you know, to throw it out there for consideration.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have anything specific to respond to, but that's like super useful comments. And as Aksel said, we're definitely gonna go over them, and we really appreciate the the take. Did you have any specific kind of last questions or things that we hadn't responded to, or?
I don't. I saw Jose's hand up, but I know we're near time.
Jose, we only have 1 minute. If you could email your question to Asher or to Aksel, I think that would be better, because we won't have time for the question and response in a minute. So yeah, I think you can see me, but that's all right. Okay, now you can see me. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks of course Asher and Andy and Aksel, who wasn't announced as a speaker but acted as a speaker, which is fantastic. And thanks to Mike, who came in person. Yeah, thanks everyone, and see you soon in the following seminars.
Yeah, thank you everyone for turning up.
And thanks everyone, it was a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions,
thank you so much. Pay your taxes.